The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital corridor as Donald Reynolds paced back and forth, his expensive shoes echoing against the polished floors. Anxiety twisted in his chest as he replayed the events of the past day. Sophia had been admitted for observation after a fainting spell, but the doctors assured him it was nothing serious. Now he stood outside a room waiting for an update, his heart pounding. The door opened, and a doctor stepped out. His face was etched with discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds," the doctor began, his voice hesitant. "But there was nothing we could do. She's gone." Donald froze, his mind rejecting the words. "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's impossible. You said she was stable yesterday. What happened?" The doctor sighed, avoiding Donald's piercing gaze. Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support. "It was sudden," he explained. "Her heart stopped during the night. We tried to resuscitate her, but no." Donald interrupted, his voice rising. "This doesn't make sense. She was fine." "I understand this is difficult," the doctor said gently, "but sometimes these things happen without warning." Donald's hands clenched into fists, his mind swirling with disbelief and anger. Sophia Green, the love of his life. The one person who had seen past his wealth and ambition to the man he truly was. She had been his anchor, his confidant. And now she was gone. Donald stumbled into the hospital's private waiting room, his legs trembling. He collapsed onto a chair, burying his face in his hands as memories of Sophia flooded his mind. Her laughter, her kindness, the way she had believed in him when no one else did. But beneath the grief, a seed of doubt began to grow. Something about this didn't feel right. Over the next few hours, Donald tried to process what had happened. The doctors were insistent that her death was natural, but his gut told him otherwise. He replayed the events of the past week in his mind, searching for clues. Sophia had been acting strange recently, more reserved, as if something was weighing on her. She had taken several mysterious phone calls late at night, and when he asked about them, she had brushed it off as work stuff. And then there was the fainting spell. Sophia had never had health issues before. Why now? Donald's mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. At the funeral home, Donald stood beside Sophia's lifeless body, his grief mingling with suspicion. "She doesn't look at peace," he murmured to himself. His assistant Mark stepped forward hesitantly. "Donald, maybe you should take a break. You haven't slept." "I'm not leaving her," Donald snapped, his voice sharp. Mark nodded silently and stepped back as Donald gazed at Sophia. A chilling thought crept into his mind. What if she's not really gone? That night, Donald sat in the corner of his dimly lit study. The weight of Sophia's death pressed heavily on his chest. The world around him had turned gray, muted by the loss of the woman he loved. But beneath the grief, a gnawing doubt refused to let him rest. Sophia's death didn't make sense. The hospital had declared her condition stable just hours before she passed. Then there was the hurried manner in which the doctors had insisted on finalizing the paperwork, urging Donald to proceed with the burial arrangements. Why were they so eager to close the chapter? Donald replayed everything he could remember about Sophia's behavior in the weeks leading up to her death. There had been signs, small, subtle clues that he had overlooked in the moment. Sophia had been receiving late-night phone calls that she always answered in hushed tones. When he asked who it was, she would brush it off with a nervous smile, saying it's just work. She had also started disappearing for hours without explanation, claiming she needed some time to think. Then there were the moments when she seemed lost in thought. Her brow furrowed, as if she were carrying a burden she couldn't share. And finally, there was the fainting spell that had led her to the hospital, a sudden collapse that she insisted was nothing serious. Donald clenched his fists, frustration building within him. Was Sophia hiding something? And if she was, could it have been connected to her death? Donald wasn't the type to believe in coincidences. His business success was built on scrutinizing every detail, questioning every inconsistency. He decided that this situation deserved the same level of scrutiny. But what could he do now with Sophia gone? That night, Donald sat at his desk, staring at the burial arrangements spread out before him. A sudden, audacious thought entered his mind. a thought so outrageous that he almost dismissed it immediately. What if I placed a camera in the coffin? It sounded insane, like the desperate act of a man who couldn't let go. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If there was even the slightest chance that something had been overlooked or hidden, he needed to know. The next morning, Donald contacted an old acquaintance, a tech specialist, who had helped him with security projects for his business. "I need a micro camera," Donald said bluntly. When the call connected the specialist, a man named Andre chuckled. "What kind of project are you working on this time, Reynolds? Industrial espionage?" "No," Donald replied, his tone serious. "This is personal. Andre est humour faded." "What do you need it for?" "That doesn't matter," Donald said firmly. "I just need something discreet, high quality, and capable of streaming live footage in real time." Andre hesitated, but eventually agreed. "I'll have something ready today." When Donald returned to the funeral home later that day, he approached the director under the guise of wanting to add a personal touch to Sophia's coffin, a small keepsake to honor her memory. The director, accustomed to wealthy clients making unusual requests, didn't question him. Donald carefully placed the micro camera inside the coffin, securing it within the lining so it wouldn't be visible as he adjusted the camera. His hands trembled. The act felt both invasive and necessary. A strange combination of guilt and resolve settled over him. Over the next 24 hours, Donald's decision began to raise eyebrows among those closest to him. "You're obsessing, Mark," his assistant said as they sat in Donald's office. "I know you're grieving, but this isn't healthy. You don't understand." Donald snapped his patience, wearing thin. "There's something wrong with this whole situation. I can feel it." Mark sighed. "What if you're wrong? What if this only makes things harder for you?" Donald's jaw tightened as he looked out the window. "And what if I'm right?" His family wasn't any more supportive. "You need to let her go, Donald," his sister Rebecca said gently over the phone. "Holding on like this won't bring her back." "I'm not holding on," Donald argued, searching for answers. Rebecca paused, her voice softening. "And what if there are no answers? What if this really was just a tragedy?" Donald clenched his teeth, the doubts creeping into his mind. "I have to try," he said finally. The day of the burial arrived, and Donald's heart was heavy as he watched the ceremony unfold. The priest spoke solemnly, offering words of comfort that barely registered in Donald's mind as the coffin was lowered into the ground. He felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Am I insane for doing this? But deep down, he knew he wouldn't find peace until he uncovered the truth. That evening, Donald sat in his study, the room dimly lit by the glow of his laptop. The office was eerily silent, the faint hum of Donald's laptop the only sound breaking the stillness. He sat in his leather chair, staring at the screen with unblinking intensity. The camera feed from Sophia's coffin showed nothing but darkness, the confined space completely still. Hours had passed since the burial, and Donald had barely moved from his seat. His nerves were frayed, his mind racing with doubt. What if this was all for nothing? What if I'm wrong? But something deep within him urged him to stay. The screen remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Donald's exhaustion began to creep in. His eyelids grew heavy just as he leaned back in his chair, contemplating a moment of rest. A faint noise jolted him upright. It was soft at first, barely audible like the rustle of fabric. Donald's pulse quickened as he leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the audio to pick up the faintest of sounds. There it was again, a faint creak followed by what sounded like breathing. He frowned. His heart was pounding. This can't be real. Minutes passed, and the noises grew more distinct. A scraping sound, like nails against wood, set a shiver down Donald's spine. Then the screen flickered. "Come on," Donald muttered, tapping the side of the laptop. The feed steadied, and for a moment all was still again. But then the faint outline of movement appeared on the screen. Donald's breath caught in his throat as he watched intently. The shadows shifted, and a pale hand came into view, trembling as it pressed against the lid of the coffin. "Jesus Christ," Donald whispered, his voice shaking. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The hand moved again, weakly scratching at the wooden interior. A moment later, Sophia's face appeared on the screen, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented. Her breath was hollow and labored. Her lips moved as if trying to speak, but no sound escaped. Sophia. Donald whispered, his chest tightening. She was alive. Donald's mind raced, a torrent of emotions crashing over him. Relief, shock, and a rising panic on the screen. Sophia continued to struggle. Her movements weakened, frantic as she pushed against the lid of the coffin. She's trapped. Donald said aloud, his voice thick with urgency. He grabbed his phone with trembling hands, dialing Mark. Pick up, he muttered, pacing the room. When Mark answered, Donald didn't wait for pleasantries. Get the car ready, he barked. We're going to the cemetery right now. Mark's confused voice came through the line. What? Donald? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? There's no time to explain, Donald snapped. Just do it. Hanging up, Donald returned to the laptop, his eyes fixed on the screen. Sophia's struggles were growing weaker, her body visibly shaking from exhaustion. Hold on, Donald whispered, his voice breaking. I'm coming for you. Minutes later, Donald sped through the empty streets. The tires of his car screeched as he took sharp turns. Mark sat in the passenger seat. His expression is a mix of concern and confusion. Donald, can you please tell me what's going on? He asked. Donald's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. Sophie is alive, he said flatly. His eyes locked on the road. Mark stared at him in disbelief. What? That's not possible. We saw her. She's alive. Donald repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument. I saw her on the camera. His car roared to life as he sped through the quiet streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. She's alive, he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. I'm coming. Sophia, just hold on. As the cemetery gates came into view, Donald pressed the gas pedal harder. His headlights illuminated the tall, wrought iron entrance. But when he reached the gates, his heart sank. They were locked. Donald jumped out of the car and ran to the gate, shaking it violently. Hello? He shouted into the stillness. Is anyone here? A small light flickered on in a nearby shack, and an older man in a security uniform emerged. His expression was annoyed. What are you doing here? The guard asked gruffly, his flashlight casting a harsh beam across Donald's face. I need to get in, Donald said urgently, pointing to the cemetery. There's someone in one of those graves who's still alive. The guard frowned, clearly thinking Donald was either drunk or crazy. Look, I don't know what you're talking about, but the cemetery is closed. He said, you'll have to come back in the morning. There's no time, Donald snapped, his voice rising. I'm telling you, a woman is trapped in a coffin right now, and she's alive. The guard shook his head. I can't let you in. Rules are rules. Donald took a deep breath, trying to calm his fraying nerves. Listen, he said, pulling out his wallet and flipping it open. I'm Donald Reynolds. You probably heard of me. If you don't open those gates right now, I'll make it worth your while. The guard hesitated, his flashlight wavering as recognition dawned on his face. Even if you are who you say you are, I could lose my job. The guard said, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Donald clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Then I'll do it myself. He talked to Mark. Get a team together. I need bolt cutters, shovels, and a crew at the cemetery now. Within 20 minutes, a small group of men equipped with tools. Donald wasted no time. The team used bolt cutters to snap the chains on the gate, and they rushed inside. Donald leading the way. The cemetery was dark and foreboding. The headstones cast long shadows under the pale moonlight. Donald's flashlight danced across the rows of graves as he made his way to Sophia's plot. When they reached it, he stopped, his chest heaving. This is it, he said, pointing to the freshly covered mound of earth. The team immediately got to work, digging frantically with shovels. The sound of metal scraping against dirt filled the air as Donald stood by his hands, trembling with anxiety. Hurry, he urged, his voice tight. We don't have much time. The digging felt like it took an eternity, but finally, the wooden lid of the coffin came into view. Stand back, one of the men said as they pried open the lid with crowbars. Donald stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as the coffin creaked open. Inside, Sophia lay motionless, her face pale and her breath shallow. Sophia? Donald whispered, his voice cracking. Her eyes fluttered open weakly, and for a moment she looked at him with a mixture of confusion and relief. Donald, she croaked, her voice barely audible. I'm here, he said, tears streaming down his face. You're safe now. I've got you. The men helped lift Sophia out of the coffin, her body trembling from exhaustion and lack of oxygen. Donald wrapped his jacket around her and held her close. His hands shook as he stroked her hair. Are you okay? He murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You're going to be okay. Sophia leaned into him. Her breath was shallow but steady. An ambulance arrived moments later, and paramedics rushed to her side, checking her vitals and loading her onto a stretcher. Donald climbed into the back of the ambulance with her, refusing to leave her side as the vehicle sped toward the hospital. He held her hand tightly, his mind racing with questions. How did this happen? Who did this to her? But for now, all that mattered was that Sophia was alive, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Sophia lay in the hospital bed, her frail frame surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hum of machines. Donald sat by her side, his eyes never leaving her face. She was still pale, but her breathing was steady now, her color slowly returning as she stirred awake. Her eyes met Donald's, filled with gratitude and something else. Fear. You're safe, Donald said softly, reaching for her hand. No one's going to hurt you. Sophia hesitated, her lips trembling. You don't understand, she whispered. This wasn't an accident. Donald frowned, his stomach tightening. What do you mean? Tears welled in her eyes as she took a shaky breath. They made me do it. They forced me to fake my death. Donald's mind raced, trying to comprehend her words. Who? Who made you do this? Sophia looked away. Her voice is barely audible. They threatened me, Donald. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd hurt me. Or worse. Donald's fists clenched at his sides, anger boiling beneath the surface. Who are they? He demanded. Tell me everything. Sophia closed her eyes, gathering her strength before speaking. It started a few months ago, she began. A man approached me. He said he knew everything about you. About us? He said he represented people who wanted control over your assets. At first, I thought he was bluffing, but then he showed me photos of you, of your schedules, even your private meetings. They knew everything. Donald. Her voice broke, and Donald leaned closer, his jaw tightening. Go on, he urged. They said the only way to get to you was through me. Sophia continued. They wanted me to fake my death to make you vulnerable. They said once you were distracted, they'd move in and take everything. They even had doctors and lawyers on their payroll to make it look real. Donald's mind reeled. The hospital's rushed procedures. The vague explanations from the doctors. It all made sense now. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice filled with anguish. I wanted to, Sophia said, tears streaming down her face. But they were watching me. They said if I tried to warn you, they'd kill you. Donald's chest tightened, his heart aching at the thought of her enduring such fear alone. Who are they? He asked again, his tone firmer this time. Sophia hesitated, then whispered a name. Victor Kane. One day the name had Donald like a punch to the gut. Victor Kane was a high-ranking executive at one of Donald's subsidiary companies, a man Donald had trusted with key projects and sensitive information. Donald shot to his feet, pacing the room, his rage coursed through him. Victor, he muttered, his fists clenching, that bastard. Sophia watched him, her voice trembling. He was the one who planned everything. He said he'd been waiting for the right moment to strike. I was just a pawn in his game. Donald turned back to her, his expression fierce. You're not a pawn, Sophia. You're the reason I'm standing here right now. And I swear I'll make him pay for what he's done. The following day, Donald called an emergency meeting with his legal team and private security consultants. We have a mole in the company, Donald said. His voice was cold and calculated. Victor Kane. I want every piece of evidence we can find. Email transactions, meetings. If he so much as sneezes near a document, I want it on my desk. His team nodded. Springing into action, Donald turned to Mark, his assistant. And I want you to find out who else is involved. If Victor had accomplices, I want their names. Over the next 48 hours, the investigation unearthed a trove of incriminating evidence. Victor had been embezzling funds, forging contracts and funneling information to outside parties. But the most damning evidence came from Sophia herself. "They gave me this," she said, handing Donald a small flash drive. "It's a copy of everything they had on you. Your accounts, your investments, and even your personal life. They wanted me to use it to manipulate you." Donald stared at the drive, his jaw tightening. "This ends now." Armed with the evidence, Donald orchestrated a trap for Victor. He called for a high-level executive meeting, ensuring Victor would attend the dimly lit conference room. Hummed with tension as Donald sat at the head of the table, his demeanor cold and unreadable around him, a carefully selected group of executives murmured quietly, unaware that this wasn't an ordinary meeting. When Victor arrived, he was his usual smug self, unaware of what awaited him. Victor Kane walked into the room with his usual air of confidence, a sly grin tugging at his lips as he greeted Donald. "Donald?" Victor said smoothly, taking a seat across from him. "You called for this meeting rather suddenly. I assume it's something urgent." Donald leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Very urgent," he replied. His voice was calm, but laced with steel. Sophia, watching from a secure room nearby with the lead investigator, felt her heart race. She had insisted on being involved, determined to see justice served. "Are you sure this will work?" she asked the investigator, her voice trembling slightly. The officer nodded. "We've got enough evidence to arrest Victor and his accomplices. But Donald's plan to extract a confession will seal the deal." Sophia's eyes flicked to the monitor, showing the live feed from the meeting room. Donald sat poised, his expression betraying nothing. She could only hope Victor's arrogance would be his undoing. In the meeting room, Donald cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I've called this meeting to discuss a pressing issue," he began, his voice steady. "It's come to my attention that someone within this company has been working against me." Victor raised an eyebrow, his expression feigning surprise. "That's a serious accusation," Victor said smoothly. "Do you have any proof?" Donald smirked, his eyes locking onto Victor's. "I thought you'd never ask." Mark, seated at a laptop nearby, pressed a button, and the large screen at the end of the room lit up. A series of documents appeared: bank statements, email correspondences, and recordings. Each one pointed directly to Victor. The room fell silent as the executives leaned forward, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What is this?" Victor demanded, his confident facade cracking. "It's evidence," Donald said, his tone razor-sharp. "Evidence of your betrayal, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate me by targeting Sophia." Victor's face turned pale, but he quickly composed himself. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "Do you think you can pin this on me with some doctor files? I've been loyal to this company for years." Donald leaned forward, his gaze icy loyalty. He said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You call threatening the woman I love and trying to destroy my life loyalty?" Victor scoffed, his confidence returning in the face of what he assumed was a bluff. "You have nothing on me," Victor said. "You're grasping at straws, Donald." Donald exchanged a glance with Mark, who nodded and pressed another button on the laptop. The screen changed to a video recording. In it, Victor sat with one of his co-conspirators, discussing the plan in detail of how they would fake Sophia's death, distract Donald, and seize control of his assets. Victor's voice in the recording was unmistakable. "We hit him where it hurts, Sophia," the video played. "Once he's too broken to fight back, we move in and take everything." The air in the room grew heavy as the damning evidence played out before everyone. Victor's composure shattered. He shot to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at Donald. "This is entrapment," he shouted. "You set me up. You set yourself up," Donald said coldly, rising from his chair. "All I did was give you enough rope to hang yourself." Victor's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally. But the other executives sat stone-faced. Their disgust was evident at that moment. The doors burst open and a team of police officers entered, led by the investigators. Sophia had been working with Victor Kane, the officer announced, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted coercion." Victor stumbled backwards, his hands raised as the officers approached. "This is a mistake," he yelled. "You'll regret this, Donald." Donald crossed his arms expression unyielding. The only mistake was thinking you could get away with it, he said as Victor was handcuffed and led away. The officers moved to detain several other individuals named in the investigation. Among them was a hospital administrator who had orchestrated Sophia's death and a lawyer who had helped forge the necessary documents. The weight of their betrayal settled heavily on Donald's shoulders, but he felt a surge of relief knowing they would face justice. Later that evening, Donald returned to the hospital where Sophia was waiting for him. She sat upright in her bed, her eyes searching his face as he entered the room. "It's done," Donald said, sitting beside her. "Victor and his people are in custody. They won't hurt anyone ever again." Sophia exhaled her shoulders, relaxing for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," she said softly. Donald shook his head. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This happened because of me. I should have seen it coming." Sophia reached for his hand, her grip firm despite her weakened state. "You saved me, Donald," she said. "That's all that matters." The following day, news of the arrest spread quickly, and Donald issued a public statement vowing to protect his company and those he cared about. But for Donald, the true victory wasn't just in exposing the conspirators. It was in knowing that Sophia was finally safe as he sat with her that night, holding her hand and planning their future. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. They had faced betrayal, fear, and danger together, and they had come out stronger for it. The days following Victor Kane's arrest were a whirlwind of media coverage, legal proceedings, and emotional recovery. But as the dust settled, Donald and Sophia found themselves standing at the edge of a new beginning. Sophia sat in the warm sunlight on the terrace of Donald's estate, a light breeze playing with her hair. She had regained some of her strength, though the physical and emotional scars from her ordeal lingered. Donald approached with 2 cups of tea, setting one gently in front of her. "You're spoiling me," Sophia said with a small smile. Her voice carried a mixture of gratitude and warmth. "You deserve it," Donald replied. Sitting beside her, they sat in comfortable silence. The weight of their shared journey fills the space between them. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Sophia asked, breaking the quiet. "All the time," Donald replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it's different now. Before, it was always about the next deal, the next milestone. Now I think about us." Sophia turned to him, her expression softening. She asked gently. Donald nodded. "I don't want to waste another second," he said, his voice steady. "Life is too short, and I've already come too close to losing you." A week later, Donald invited Sophia to his family's countryside estate, a place they had often talked about visiting during the early days of their relationship. It was a sprawling property surrounded by rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and ancient oaks. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, Donald led Sophia to a secluded spot overlooking a quiet lake. "This place is beautiful," Sophia said, her eyes wide as she took in the view. "It's special to me," Donald said, his tone thoughtful. "It's where I used to come when I needed clarity, when everything else felt too big to handle." Sophia turned to him, her expression curious. "Why did you bring me here?" Donald smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a stunning engagement ring, the diamond catching the light and scattering it in 1,000 directions. Sophia's breath hitched, her hands flying to her mouth. "Donald," he dropped to one knee, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sophia, we've been through more than most people can imagine. We faced feared betrayal and pain. But through it all, you've been my anchor, my strength, my reason to keep fighting." Tears welled in her eyes as she listened, her heart pounding. "I can't promise a life without challenges," Donald continued. "But I can promise that no matter what comes our way, I'll be by your side, loving you and protecting you with everything I have. Will you marry me?" Sophia stared at him, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. 1,000 times yes. Donald slipped the ring on her finger before standing and pulling her into a tight embrace. They stayed like that for a long moment, the world around them fading into insignificance. "You've made me the happiest man alive," Donald murmured into her hair. Sophia smiled through her tears. And you've given me hope again. In the weeks that followed, Donald and Sophia began laying the groundwork for their new life together. But they couldn't shake the lingering impact of what they had endured. We can't just move on and pretend it never happened, Sophia said one evening as they sat in Donald's study, sorting through documents. I know, Donald replied, his expression thoughtful. But what can we do? Sophia held up a photo of the two of them from a charity gala years earlier. We use what we've been through to help other people who've been betrayed, manipulated, or left behind. They need a voice, someone to fight for them. Donald nodded slowly, a spark of determination lighting in his eyes. A foundation, he said, one that provides support, resources, and protection for victims of fraud, coercion, and abuse. Sophia's face lit up. Yes, we could offer counseling, legal aid, and financial assistance to help people rebuild their lives. Donald stood by her side, his heart swelling with pride as he watched her shine. She had transformed from a victim into a beacon of hope, and he couldn't have been prouder to call her his partner in every sense of the word. As the gala came to an end, the two of them stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The twinkling lights below were a reflection of the life they had rebuilt together. Do you think we're doing enough? Sophia asked, her voice quiet. Donald took her hand, interlocking their fingers. We're just getting started, he said with a smile as Donald and Sophia turned their pain into purpose. Their story became a testament to the power of resilience, love, and second chances, from surviving betrayal and darkness to building a brighter future together. They showed us that even in the face of unimaginable challenges, hope and healing are always possible. Thank you for joining us on Donald and Sophia's incredible journey, a story of betrayal, survival, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. From facing the unimaginable and unmasking dark conspiracies to finding strength in each other, their story teaches us that resilience and determination can help us overcome even the most devastating obstacles. Through their struggles, they discovered that true healing comes from embracing the pain, learning from it, and turning it into something meaningful. Their journey reminds us that no matter how hard life gets, we always can rebuild, protect, and love again. If you found inspiration in this story, please subscribe to our channel for more uplifting journeys. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and like the video to help us grow our community of hope and healing.